4.5 isn't actually a dry patch because Genshin randomly dropped some huge lore that might have something to do with Arlecchino, or even better, a future Dainsleif quest. Although it's hard to forget Dainsleif, this video will be a summary of everything we currently know about Arlecchino, her lore and major theories and speculations I have regarding the clues left in the mysterious new books in 4.5 and her drip marketing. To start off, did you know that there were 2 Arlecchinos? Yeah, this is actually canon lore and not theory, and this video will cover a little bit about the other Arlecchino as well. I'm your leafy Minsleif and I read the Genshin Impact lore so you don't have to. This video is sponsored by Tower of Fantasy, the fantastical open-world MMORPG that you can play for free on both PC and mobile. Set hundreds of years in the future on the distant planet of Ida, Tower of Fantasy is an anime-infused sci-fi adventure which contains one of my favorite features ever in any video game: character customization. Aside from the beautiful graphics, elaborate lore, and extremely in-depth free character customization, Tower of Fantasy is celebrating its highly anticipated collaboration with Evangelion in its version 3.7 update, which is available right now. Most importantly, you can play as Asuka. A new chapter of Tower Fantasy is here, with Evangelion joining against the Angels. As the Executor yourself, team up with the 3 Evangelion multi-purpose humanoid decisive weapons and the Vera Guardians in an all-out battle against the challenging creatures. Players will also be able to serve as the pilot of the original mecha of Tower of Fantasy, an ancient piece of war equipment that was reactivated by Memoria in the battle against the Angels alongside the Evangelion units. But that's not all. Try out the newly updated Frontier Clash with Asuka and earn free rewards in the series of Evangelion-themed events. Available for a limited time from March 12th to April 30th. A new Smart Servant Pen as players' best battle helper will also join on March 12th. And the newly specialized and refitted vehicle Soul Plugs enable players to traverse varied terrains. Click the link in the description and in the pinned comment of this video to download Tower of Fantasy for free so you don't miss out on this huge collaboration and get huge rewards like Red Nucleus, Dark Crystals, special vouchers, and more. Thank you so much to Tower of Fantasy for sponsoring today's video. As of making this video, not much is currently known about Arlecchino's past. This video was made around the time of her drip marketing, so hello future viewers, and that's awesome if we get to learn more stuff about her. What we do know about her lore is taken from the Linny siblings' character stories and very few quests. The names of the Fatui Harbinger titles come from the Commedia dell'Arte, a form of Italian theater that was popular throughout Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. In the 16th century, the usual role of Arlecchino was that of a faithful, poor, slow-witted servant who was destined to be forever hungry and desperate for money. Knave also means servant, which explains Arlecchino's alternative title as the Knave. The French version of Arlecchino was Arlequin or Harlequin, and the solution for his problems was conning people. By the 17th century, Arlecchino's role evolved and the figure had become a cunning master of disguises, so much so that he often masquerades himself to be a foreign nobleman. The transformation of Arlecchino's character during the peak of the Commedia dell'Arte's popularity is mirrored in Genshin's lore. There were actually 2 Arlecchinos, someone who I'll refer to as the Previous Knave and the current one we all love and know today. The Previous Knave was an extremely cruel woman who'd often resorted to blackmail to subdue others. I mean, she was a Fatui Harbinger, so are we really surprised? She despised failure and administered searingly painful punishments to those who failed to complete her tasks, children included. When Perinheri was a child, his father accrued an enormous amount of debt and had gotten into trouble with loan sharks who demanded their home in Perinheri as payment. Perinheri's mother had refused and entrusted her son to the care of the House of the Hearth in order to keep him safe from the loan sharks. The Previous Knave used this unfortunate situation to blackmail Perinheri into submission. She lied to him, claiming that his mother had sold him off to her to settle a debt. Poor Perinheri had no other choice but to obey the Previous Knave, otherwise she'd withdraw her alleged protection over his mother. When Arlecchino came into power as the new Fatui Harbinger, she revealed to Perinheri that the Previous Knave had lied to him. She'd never protected his mother, and all that was left of his mother was a bloodied music box that Arlecchino had retrieved for him. According to the Inazuma World Quest, the very special fortune slip, Chitose tells Traveler that several years ago from the current story, the Previous Knave was defeated by a child at the House of the Hearth and was replaced. This wording can imply 2 things. One, Arlecchino was originally an orphan at the House of the Hearth who had defeated the Previous Knave and had come to power as the 4th Fatui Harbinger all very recently. Or 2, the battle just took place at the House of the Hearth and Arlecchino wasn't an orphan there. As for how young she was when she ascended the Fatui hierarchy, or if she was an orphan, escaped, grew up, then challenged the previous knave, we don't really know. But Hoyoverse did something rather interesting during the release of version 4.5. I know people like to harp on this patch for being an empty patch, no world expansion or Archon quest, but the biggest and most unexpected thing may have dropped out of nowhere. Lore. Actual Khaenri'ah lore dropped out of thin air during version 4.5. If you make your way to the FONTAINE bookstore, you'll find 2 new books, volumes 1 and 2 of Perinheri. A story based on a legendary tale allegedly known throughout Khaenri'ah. It's an anthological work produced over several generations. To recap, the Irminsul is essentially a database of all historical events and memories that have happened in Teyvat. The Irminsul can be tampered with, however, and these records can be altered drastically. To prevent that, Teyvatians have recorded historical events in the form of allegories or fairy tales. But since no one can conveniently confirm the legitimacy of Perinheri, and since this book series is a culmination of work produced over several generations and several authors, it's gonna be interesting to try to correlate all this new information with Arlecchino. I think we can all agree that there's definitely no coincidence that this massive deep lore drops on the heels of Arlecchino's drip marketing, since Genshin's no stranger to using prior patches to hint at future ones. Yaimiko's Facebook post, which hints at the Sumeru Archon quest, Covering of Good and Evil, which hints at the FONTAINE Archon quests, and so on. According to the new Perinheri books, Khaenri'ah had allegedly started an orphanage in search of a specific child, a descender, outlanders or aliens who have wills that can rival an entire world. This definition is very specific since travelers are a descender but their sibling is not, despite both of them being alien to Teyvat. Perinheri's first memory was that of being asked by the grown-ups to crawl through a dark corridor which might have been a chimney for winter fires. When Perinheri reached the end of that corridor at last, the exit had not opened yet. He knocked, only for the grown-ups to coldly ask, "Are you dead?" Perinheri saw an illusion within the corridor, the crimson moon hanging high in the pitch-dark night sky, suddenly turned around, revealing itself to be a titanic, horrified eye. The adults opened the door and embraced the soot-covered Perinheri. "You have traversed the fire of 2 worlds within the hearth, and here you are reborn." There are heavy references to hearth and fire, 2 things very much associated with Arlecchino, with her being the current head of the House of the Hearth Fatui orphanage and having a pyro vision. In Volume 2 of the story, Perinheri's friend Leobrandt gets turned into a monster as punishment for being a descendant of those who forsook their god and came to the kingdom. Very reminiscent of how people who weren't full-blooded Khaenri'ahs were turned into Hilichurls in Khaenri'ah. The Arlecchino Hilichurl associations are already in full swing due to the Netzitzenkreuz Ordo questline, specifically the world quest having to do with an NPC named Caterpillar. Notice how his hands are very similar to the markings we see in Arlecchino. There's reason to believe that Caterpillar is the revived consciousness of a man named Carter Sherbius, transposed into a Hilichurl's body. The imagery of Perinheri being dead and being reborn in a chimney might have something significant to do with Arlecchino. This next theory requires some prior knowledge of the Netzitzenkreuz questline, but I have a video summarizing all the major events and theories here. But I'll do my best to summarize it quickly in the context of Arlecchino's possible lore. We've theorized before that Arlecchino could be the collected consciousness of Basil Elton. Basil Elton was the vice director of the Netzitzenkreuz Institute, an orphanage in Fontaine that existed about 500 years ago. She was also the admiral of the Fontainian Armada and was allegedly killed when her ship, the Sponsian, lunged itself into LNS during the Cataclysm, LNS being the giant sea monster whose remains you see in Fontaine. I know this is a very popular theory, and even I came to a similar conclusion myself, but there might be a huge problem with this. Jacob, Ingold, and René were researchers in Fontaine who experimented by dissolving Fontainians in primordial water and tried resurrecting their consciousness into a new body. They were able to do this after studying the Abyss and Khaenri'ah text. Caterpillar was created about 400 to 500 years ago, and it should be around this time that Basil Elton would have been allegedly revived. For Arlecchino to be a resurrection of Basil Elton, this means Arlecchino would have had to have been created 400 to 500 years ago. The issue is, Femina recently remembers her beating the previous knave and claiming her Harbinger title. Chitose also corroborates Femina's story, stating Arlecchino's rise to power was recent. This would insinuate that Basil Arlecchino was just kind of meandering for 400-500 years after creation, and ideally, we would have had more records of her if she'd existed for this long. If this isn't the case, then another thought is actually very scary. If she is a Hilichurl homunculus, Arlecchino was made recently. Which is scary because this strange, perhaps abyssal or Khaenri'ah practice of resurrecting a previously dead consciousness into a new body is still happening. But let's go back to Perinheri for a sec. The story of Perinheri allegedly originated from the Crimson Moon dynasty of Khaenri'ah. Khaenri'ah has two dynasties that we know of so far, Crimson Moon and the Eclipse dynasty. Arlecchino's title is the Dire Bale Moon, and although Bale Moon isn't technically a real word, we can gather that Bale Moon could mean a moon that's an evil omen. Which honestly perfectly lines up with the eclipse imagery of Khaenri'ah. The word eclipse comes from the Greek word meaning abandonment, and in ancient Greece, an eclipse was considered a form of the god's anger and abandonment of the earth. An omen, if you will. A crimson moon is a lunar eclipse, and in Mandarin, the Eclipse dynasty in Khaenri'ah is more accurately described as the Black Sun dynasty, meaning a solar eclipse. This leads me to believe that Arlecchino might be the collected consciousness of a figure from the Crimson Moon dynasty in another body. This might be the most likely scenario with the release of the Perinheri books in version 4.5. Either Crimson Moon dynasty from Khaenri'ah or a figure from Remuria, the ancient Fontainian civilization, since she expresses such a desire to protect Fontaine, claiming she even comes from there during the Archon quests. Or even worse, and even wilder, she could be the collected consciousness of the possibly deceased third descender. The body of the third descender, according to Skirk, was used to create the Gnosis. Arlecchino could have been an attempt to restore the third descender back into being. So she's not necessarily the third descender themselves, but an attempt to resurrect their consciousness. However, there are things to refute this theory. Nahida states that the top-ranked Fatui Harbingers up to number 3 possess power comparable to that of the gods. Arlecchino is number 4, with Dottore, Columbina, and possibly Piero surpassing her in power. We expect Descenders to be more powerful than Archons since they possess the power to rival the will of the entire world of Teyvat and can allegedly create, sustain, protect, and destroy worlds. The only thing potentially going for an Arlecchino Descender connection is Piero's quote in her drip marketing. Fate grants favors to no one. Only those who would fight it with every ounce of their being may earn the right to challenge it. And who but a Descender can challenge fate? I'll cover Perinheri more in a future video since there's so many interesting things with it. Apparently, the gender of Perinheri changes in Mandarin depending on which traveler you choose. And it's also a retelling of the real-life story Orlando Innamorato, an epic poem written by the Italian Renaissance author Matteo Maria Boiardo. But let's dip out of theory time for a moment. So, there were 2 Arlecchinos and the previous knave was a cruel woman. According to the very special Fortune Slip World Quest, some members of the House of the Hearth still carry on in honor of the previous knave. The current Arlecchino seems to have more care towards the children in the orphanage. Some people might say Arlecchino is from an evil organization, so she must be evil too, and there can't possibly be any positive redeeming traits for her, but hear me out. She's just a morally gray character. Yes, her methods in order to achieve her goals might be radical. She has actually killed people. But there's actually concrete evidence that she's not as evil as maybe some of the more notorious Fatui members. Again, morally gray. She did save and help the people of Poussin, and she did really want to stop the Fontaine prophecy from coming true. She might have had ulterior motives to do so, like gaining the Spina di Rosula's trust and assistance, but still. During the Fontaine Archon quest, we learned that Linny and Lynette were adopted by a cruel man. This foster father gifted Lynette to another man who had expressed interest in her during one of the twins' magic shows. By the time Linny arrived to rescue Lynette, Arlecchino was standing there, in the moonlit ground covered in blood, having already taken care of this man, rescued Lynette, as well as several girls hidden in a basement. Although Arlecchino seems to express genuine care for the children at the House of the Hearth, their following of her is almost cult-like in nature. They call her Father, a title usually reserved for priests in Catholic churches, and even her house mantra to Lyney sounds eerie.
The House of the Hearth welcomes you, for your interests align with ours. Here, none will ever betray you. Indeed, betrayal shall never be permitted here.
Which is interesting because betrayal is highly discouraged in the House of the Hearth, yet Wanderer and Child suggest that she'd actually be the most likely harbinger to betray the Fatui. The role of the Harlequin or servant in the Commedia dell'Arte was often to thwart the plans of their master. Arlecchino also has these children performing missions on her behalf, for example, the Lyney siblings in their character stories and in the FONTAINE Archon quests. She strongly prohibits the use of delusions according to Lyney's character story. If Arlecchino isn't actually a Hilichurl homunculus like Caterpillar, then perhaps a delusion might explain her burned-looking hands. Speaking of burned-looking hands, Arlecchino's constellation is Ignis Purgatorius, or Purgatorial Fire, which fits so well with the Catholic father imagery I was mentioning earlier. According to Catholicism, purgatory is a passing state between heaven and hell where those who die in God's grace basically have another chance to atone for their sins in the afterlife and move on to heaven. Essentially, purgatory is a place of temporary suffering. Indulgences or money could be given by the living to pay the debt of a deceased loved one who is stuck in purgatory. We've speculated this in the past, but we might have a hint towards Arlecchino's constellation in the game. This is an emblem containing all the constellations of the Fatui Harbingers, and this constellation of a hand holding a candle might be Arlecchino's. Ignis Purgatorius again means purgatorial fire, and this symbol of a hand holding a candle is called the Hand of Glory, originating from an old European form of punishment where a murderer would be hanged and the hand that committed the crime of murder would be amputated and dried while holding a candle. Which is honestly fitting considering Arlecchino is actually a murderer. It's also interesting to note that purgatorial fire could allude to the FONTAINE Archon quest theme of sinners needing to pay for their sins. But with the amount of hype Arlecchino's been generating, I honestly doubt she has to work or pay hard for people to forgive her. Players will probably be the one doing the paying, let's be honest. I'm hoping if you found this video in a sea of videos which will not be named, then I hope you learned something new about our fiery Fatui father. And I hope you got to see that there's more to her than just being a boot hill expert. If you'd like more videos like this, please leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. I'm your Leafy Lore Minsleif, and I read the Genshin Impact lore so that you don't have to.